So last question specifically
Okay.
on LeSS. What's been your favorite scenario where people have been trying something that could be less like? I'm trying to avoid the question of saying, what's been your the obvious question, what has been your favorite less adoption?
Yeah.
Because I'm not a big fan of that language either. But what's been your most
Okay, so
favorable
just for the sake,
experience?
I will use the term just to. So, what's my favorite less adoption? From so there's two ways of answering this question. What's been my favorite personally, and what's been most effective for the client. And so my personal favorite was probably that first one, because I just learned so much. And that first adoption were Craig and Mike Cohen and Goico and Gordon and Gully and Lee and all these names brought me back to that 18-year-old self. It almost like removed years of gumph, and there's like the idea of technical debt, organizational debt, but then there's like cognitive bias debt and gumph in my brain that I had accumulated over years of playing a corporate game and ascending and becoming director and all this kind of stuff, and wanting to become managing director. So from a personal standpoint, probably the most rewarding was that initial one. And it also changed the trajectory of my career. I quit after that. I changed the design of my life, what I was trying to pursue, my balance with my family. And so that's a profoundly meaningful adoption for me on a personal level. From a client standpoint, what's been the most valuable? I think there was a adoption I worked on in Chicago, and I could see the lives of the product team improving. Like I can see them happier. Like when I got there, it was just like really dull gray, at least in my mind's eye as I'm thinking about this. I just felt like Gotham or something, like inside the building, people just, it's probably raining inside too, and how I'm thinking about it right now. And within, I want to say a year, it was bright, there was life, there was buzz. And I remember, and I have a series of questions that I ask to see if things are getting better. And one of them is going to the real product owner, and saying, do you think you're getting more value out of the product development organization? And he said, absolutely. He's like, I'm getting a lot more value. And what I'm finding above all else is that the contentious relationship we had, where I would ask for something and the change control procedures and that war, we call it the contract game, but he doesn't use the terminology. Mm-hmm. He's like, I don't have that anymore. Like I tell them I changed my mind, and the thing changes. And I was like, yeah, that's the point of the whole thing. And he's like, oh, if that's the point, yeah, things are better. But so not only there was more value from the product owner, that's probably the tertiary benefit for me. That the primary benefit is like people just seemed a whole lot happier to be at work. So that particular one is probably a highlight for me from a customer standpoint, as opposed to a personal.
Was that the happiness? Was that something which you just observed, or did you try and calculate that in any way? Just I know it's maybe an odd question, but I know that people will maybe be thinking along those lines.
Eventually tried to quantify it. I went through this whole stage in my life or my career where I'm like, oh, this is all anecdotal. I need to become more grown up. And I looked into things like the happiness ladder and ways in which I can quantify happiness, and realized it's just really, really incredibly difficult. And I would just ask people, are things better? Are you happier at work? Because when I tried to quantify it, and I remember this, I tried to calculate this and quantify it in a bank, and I one of the questions was, are you more happy, same happiness, less happy, or something like that, just as to gauge the team's happiness. And what I ran into is some cultural issues. Like when I was like did the roadshow of these metrics, some guy in England was like, "What do you mean by happiness? Like, what does that word mean?" Like the Americans had like a they didn't have, but some of the English had this like this
That's very
allergic
cynical,
reaction
aren't
to
we?
like, what do you mean by the word happiness? And and like and so yeah, again, short answer, I just asked. Long answer, I've had difficulty in gathering real data around happiness.
It's a fascinating one. It's a fascinating one because it is one of those things which you can see. But I do find that there's been plenty of times when I've been in contexts where we've been using less and trying parts of it, and people have seemed happier. Rather frustratingly, then it's always
Yeah,
the less happy voices which seem to be the loudest. It's interesting. People, but particularly maybe it's maybe more of a British thing as well. But people are less inclined to stand up and say, "Do you know what? I'm happier. I'm actually happier than I was before. This is brilliant." People are much more inclined to stand up and say, "Do
yeah.
you know
And
what? All this isn't actually that great. I'm not
having
very
lived
happy in
in
what's
Britain for
happening here."
12 years, I love the fact that there's a culture of raising your voice. Again, this is all my own personal experience. I love the fact that in Britain people are much more to your face around how they feel. When I first got there, I was like, why are people so aggressive and hurting my my feelings? But then I've come to really value that. But it's also worth saying that there you cannot introduce change into an organization and expect everyone to be happy. I was specific to say after a certain period of
Yeah.
time, but during introducing a new order of things, not many people are very happy, except the fringe that were like, oh, we've been waiting for this forever, like, and come to life, and most likely will become coaches in the future. But the majority of people, the uncertainty, the here we go again, this is another change effort. Yeah, there isn't a lot of there isn't a lot of happiness in the beginning.
No. Yeah, and that's if people are looking to use less to get instant happiness, then maybe this is not the case. But I've always argued that this is the same with any large change effort. If you're, I mean, I've been involved in when I was particularly at Royal Bank of Scotland, there was so much huge change that was happening. As the organisation slowly contracted, as the realization that we were majority owned by the UK citizens, right? We were bailed out by the taxpayer as that increasingly dawned and the large changes just kept happening and happening and happening, no one
Yeah,
was
there's
particularly
a ton
happy
of
about it.
uncertainty, a ton of what does this mean for me and my family? Am I going to have a job at the end of this? And that's one of the things
Yeah.
less hits at the core of a person's identity sometimes, because
Mm-hmm.
what is it that less says is that the roles go from a couple dozen to three, maybe four. And then so you immediately think, so where do I fit into this? And no matter how much we say there's uh, job safety, not role safety, those words are in one ear, out the other. And so you say, okay, so I was a QA manager
Yeah.
and I played the game right for 20 years and became, director as a or whatever as a senior QA manager, and I have an entire team of offshore QA people, and I've done everything right. And now you're telling me there's not only the QA role as we understand it, this external QA role. Where do I fit into this? Do you want me to be a developer? Do you want me to be a scrum master? And so there is a lot of I've grown to have a ton of empathy for people going through this type of change.
Yeah. And I think you're right. The job safety, not role safety, is a difficult one because for some people, that if their role changes and they don't want that job anymore, and people can't, aren't willing to go on a journey, and it's a difficult one for people. I think that empathy is a
Yeah.
huge huge thing that we have to remember that. And this is one thing I always try and remind myself, is that you look back through the history of an organization,
Yeah,
it's just full of people who have just tried their best. You look at what's happening right
exactly.
now, it's just full of people who are trying their best. And in the
Yeah.
future, probably people will continue to try their best. And it's difficult to, to go in, and people start getting these ideas for certain changes they want to make, and they say, "Well, don't worry, you'll still have a job." It's like, well, like you're saying, I've just done my best, and now it appears my job doesn't really
Yeah.
exist in the same way or at all anymore. So what, it's weird. What journey do I have to go on? And I think this is where, if putting agile coaching to one side, I think real professional coaching to help people in these difficult, and challenging career decisions is massively important. And this is one of the interesting things I picked up from around the pre-theory on team coaching around my tutors at Henley. And they were saying that for a long time they believed that, from a coaching perspective, it was challenge and then support. But actually, when they begin to look at things now, particularly team coaching,
That's
it provides support before challenge. So, wait, what support mechanisms can we put in place for people before we go on this, before we even begin to say, oh, we're going to change this, or we're going to look at how we're going to model our product, or what the definition of done, and how the structure is going to change. How do we put in some support mechanisms so that people have people to talk to, and that people don't feel pushed out of an organization that they
And
put their all into for
we
a long
need
time?
to think more about this, because there's going to be a lot more of this. If you just look outside even of our industry and where our society is going, there's going to be a lot of people displaced. Let's just say 10 years from now, and all these drivers are going to be, whether truck drivers, I forgot how many people are employed by truck drivers, or are truck drivers, or drivers in urban areas, and all of a sudden they're not going to have automation will do away with that. So it's not just going to be I feel like it's this roles going away. It's going to accelerate in the next 10 years dramatically. And and people really are going to have to contend with it. And so, yeah, it's going to be, an interesting decade that we're in.
Yeah, it'd be like a very, very
Yeah,
large, long, less
and things
adoption,
are,
perhaps.
like, all of this global stuff that's happening, whether pandemics and all this kind of stuff, is just accelerating the inevitable. Like, I always, when talking about my children to my wife, and I think always tell her, like, the most important thing we have to instill in them is, after character, is the ability to learn very fast, because things are
Yeah,
constantly changing. Like, I'm trying to wrap my head around NFTs now for a couple of months, and I think I finally get it. And then something else changes, and you're like, oh, if you really want to get it, you need to understand smart contracts or DAOs, and all that. It's just, the world is, as a techie, I feel like a Luddite, and it's just moving so incredibly fast.
it is. And this is, well, hopefully, I mean, I would love it if, and as if more people really got and embraced a lot of the things we've been doing for years, because I feel that that ability to learn
Yeah,
quickly, I think we've got a lot to offer, the world, and a lot to offer children, students. I think there's a lot we
absolutely.
can be teaching earlier in people's academic careers around different ways to do it. Perhaps we need to get some of that academic research in place so that it becomes
If
more
your point is really
more
valuable.
accepted.
If kids are just taught systems thinking, and I actually, the fifth discipline, right, which is like the book, or one of the books on systems
Yeah.
thinking. I actually did a thing with my kids called the fish discipline, and used fish and plastic and what's happening with just throwing away plastic in the ocean, and how that's impacting fish, and we're actually eating it in sushi. There's like a degree of plastic in every sushi bite we eat, because of, we're just throwing plastic everywhere, and the fish are eating it. And really what I'm trying to do is teach them systems thinking, not just this narrow cause and effect type mentality they're taught in school. And so, if one thing children academia, or especially young kids, can learn about from LeSS, it would be systems thinking or viewing the interconnectivity of things.
And just see, I would add to that I think that we like kids. I think we need to people need to be taught more about what it is to
Mm,
work as an actual team, because I think that well formed, well working teams full of happy people are naturally thinking
yeah,
systemically, because it isn't about you anymore. You're thinking about your teammates, and you're thinking about what's coming up, and you're thinking about what's going on for these people in their outside lives. And I think that's we naturally become more inclined to think systemically when we're working with others. But schools, at least to my understanding, still seem to be
yeah, yeah.
reasonably focused on smart individuals rather than kind of looking at things collectively. And
Well, and we're
I think we
also,
miss a trick with these things.
if you look at children today, they are learning those skill sets by through video games, not through school. I mean, watch them, and I'm
Yeah.
really blown away sometimes watching them play video games with their friends and organizing. So terrified a little bit, but also like they are self-organizing. They're doing everything natively that we're teaching organizations. You know, they're maybe for uh, just to capture the flag or to blow up. Maybe not for the best purposes, but they are learning those things outside of school. And so what we're
Yeah.
missing is teaching those things for more effect, teaching those set of skills inside of school for better purposes. But our children are living in two worlds: the
Mm-hmm.
200-year-old world, dated world at school, and a completely different reality um, outside of school.
I mean, to bring it back to LeSS for a second, I think this is why, for me, this is one of the reasons why LeSS is quite brilliant when it works well, is because it
Yeah,
unleashes really powerful teams, and I think that's fantastic. But then I find that's also one of the biggest challenges, because organisations talk a good game when it comes to teams. Most of them don't
yeah.
really understand what that means. Like people don't understand really what a team is and how you teach teams differently. But then added to that, it's the one thing that LeSS, and I know, yeah, it's interesting, and this is something that I've always kind of confused and unconfused myself periodically with. Is it's this idea of strong team identities, because it isn't about making a strong team which then ignores the broader system and does what they think is
Yeah,
best. It's making a team which is systemically aware, and works well with the teams. Because you can have the best team in the world, but they won't be the best team in the world if
yeah,
they
yeah.
are alienating themselves to the broader system. And this is where you want strong teams, and you want teams with a good identity, but that identity can't be at the
That's why
cost of
it
them
doesn't
actually
work
working well as
if
part
you
of the
don't
broader
have
system.
a really compelling, really good product owner to bring those teams together, because teams are inherently insular and we want them to be systemic, but when they have a mission, most of the times they're focused on that mission. At least this is, and maybe there is a maturity level I haven't yet seen where they're systems thinkers, but I think that's where the really strong product owner comes in, is it to really like remind the teams of the greater system. And that's really probably the
Mm.
role of, and I hate to bring him up because he's the new Steve Jobs, but that is the role of Elon Musk, and that's how he at least describes his role, is to, and he uses the term subsystem optimization, which is another way of saying local optimization, and his job is to create the environment where teams avoid subsystem optimizations, because it can be catastrophic in SpaceX. And so, yeah, I mean, there's one thing about creating a great team, which I agree with, but then making them system aware until they are reach that level of maturity, I think that's where having a great product owner comes in.